Welcome to our new series, Rethinking Israel's Future. My name is Michael Brenner, and I'm the director of American University's Center for Israel Studies. For decades, the two-state solution was praised as the only way to achieve a just and lasting peace in the Middle East. And ever since the Peel Commission had recommended the partition of Palestine into a Jewish and an Arab state in 1937, and the United Nations had voted for the partition of Palestine 10 years later, the only question was, what kind of two states should there be? And of course, more questions arose in all the negotiations, from Madrid in 1991 to Oslo in 1993 to Camp David and Taba in 2001. Where would the border be between a Jewish and a Palestinian state? What about the status of Jerusalem? Who would safeguard the security of Israel? And how would the West Bank and the Gaza Strip be connected? What about the return of Palestinian refugees and their descendants? What should be done with the Jewish settlers in a Palestinian entity? These are, of course, only a few of the many questions that arise with a two-state solution. In recent years, the frustration over a possible two-state solution has grown. It was expressed by right and by left-wing activists, and by politicians, by Israelis and by Palestinians. And it also found expression in the world of academia. I'm just thinking of the book published by renowned political scientist Ian Lustig, Paradigm Lost, From Two-State Solution to One-State Reality, and also of a recent article by Israeli historian Yuval Harari, only published in Hebrew. The latest book arguing for a one-state solution is Omri Boehm's Haifa Republic, fresh out of the press and published by New York Review Books. We have Dr. Boehm here with us today to discuss this issue together with two renowned scholars on Israel and the Middle East. And before I introduce our speakers, allow me a few housekeeping remarks. Our event panel will last approximately 1 hour, and the last part of it will be dedicated to your questions. Please submit them through the Q&A function on your screen, and you can do so throughout our conversation. We ask that no one record this event. We will record it, and the recording will be available on our website after the fact. This event is live captioned. It is now my pleasure to briefly introduce our three panelists. Dr. Omri Boehm is professor of philosophy at the New School in New York, which he joined in 2010 after his studies in Tel Aviv and Yale, where he received his PhD. He teaches and writes on early modern philosophy, philosophy of religion, and the modern Middle East. His books include The Binding of Isaac, a religious model of disobedience, and Kant's Critique of Spinoza. His latest book, Haifa Republic, a democratic future for Israel, develops a model for binational Zionism. And in addition to his academic publications, he has also written for outlets, including the New York Times, Haaretz, and in fact, his analysis of a possible future of the Israeli-Palestinian situation also appeared in the Washington Post. Dr. Yael Aronoff is the Michael and Elaine Serling and Friends Endowed Chair in Israel Studies and the Director of Jewish Studies at Michigan State University. She is also the immediate past president of the Association for Israel Studies. She earned a BA in International Relations from Princeton University and both an MIA in International Affairs and a PhD in Political Science from Columbia University. She's the author of The Political Psychology of Israeli Prime Ministers, When Hardliners Opt for Peace. Aronoff's research, which focuses on Israeli politics and foreign policy, Israeli society and culture, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, has appeared widely in journals including Foreign Policy, Israel Studies Forum, Israel Studies Review, and Political Science Quarterly. Dr. Salihbaa Sarsar was born and raised in Jerusalem. He's a political scientist with a specialization in Middle Eastern affairs and the recipient of several honors, including the Award of Academic Excellence from the American Task Force on Palestine, the Global Visionary Award, and the Stafford Presidential Award of Excellence from Monmouth University. Also, the Humanitarian Award from the National Conference for Community and Justice and the Holy Land Christian Economical Foundation Award. He was featured in the New York Times article, His Mission, Finding Why People Fight, A Witness to Mideast Conflict Turns to Dialogue and Peace. And he's the editor of Palestine and the Quest for Peace, and also, among other writings, co-editor with Hussein Ibish, and we also have featured here, of Principles and Pragmatism, Key Documents from the American Task Force on Palestine. And let me start our discussion with Omri Boehm. Omri, you have just published a book on the one-state solution called The Haifa Republic. And I wonder, how is your book different from earlier books on the topic? What is your approach, maybe also as a philosopher? And why is it called The Haifa Republic?
Yeah, well, first, before answering this, as a good politician, let me just thank you for the invitation and say also for the record with the crowd, what a pleasure it is to discuss with everybody here. I think that my possibly unique perspective on the situation is, in a way, the vision of a philosopher, in the sense that it begins not necessarily just with the practical impossibilities of a two-state solution, even though I'm interested also in that, and I will say a few words about that in a moment, but also in the argument which takes up Israeli Zionist liberal philosophers that a Jewish democracy is in fact a contradiction. So I do not believe, unlike other prominent Israeli philosophers, say Avishai Margalit or Moshe Halbertal, Michael Walzer, I do not believe that a Jewish democracy is possible, and that informs very much my position on the question of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because it informs the question of what is going to be the desired outcome of resolving such a conflict. In very brief, the reason why I think a Jewish democracy is impossible is that a democracy needs to assert always the sovereignty of citizens as such, whereas a Jewish democracy asserts the sovereignty of Jews, of the Jewish people, not of citizens as such. And that's, of course, something that's extremely controversial and something that also we can discuss more. It is from that political, philosophical argument that I proceed also to look at the two-state solution. And I think that as a practical matter, the two-state solution is no longer viable, not for the reasons that are usually mentioned in most works on the topic, namely the number of settlers, the location of settlements, and so forth. But actually, the main reason is the number of Palestinians. People forget that today between the Jordan River and the Palestinian Sea lives a Palestinian majority, and that even the most generous two-state offers that majority sovereignty on about 22% of the land. That is not a compromise. Again, that's a philosophical notion, to go with Avishai Margalit. That's, in my view, not a compromise that is sustainable, not just because it is unjust, but because it is not the type of a compromise that can bring peace. For that reason, I tried to develop a federative constellation, one that allows us to preserve Zionist ambitions of Jewish self-determination alongside Palestinian self-determination, although in one, under one citizenship, under one state with one constitution that ensures the sovereignty, the equal sovereignty of all citizens. That's a structure that has been proposed by others in the past, but it can have different constellations. We can discuss the details, even though I do not think that the details at the moment are the things that matters the most. I rather think that offering a general vision legitimizing such a vision, showing that it is possible and necessary, is a main task of moving forward today towards making progress in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'll stop here just for time.
Yeah, I'm sure we will come back to you soon, but let's first hear from Dr. Aronoff. Yael, you have, of course, written a lot about Israel, and I think, like most of us in the field, a two-state solution was kind of usually the given. I just wonder what your view is, and also maybe we have to think about how one state would be a Jewish and democratic state, or wouldn't it be a Jewish state? But I'll let you start with whatever your view is on the future of this territory.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. We, of course, haven't had the opportunity to read Omri's book, so we can only kind of respond to what is. And because the thrust, we have 5 minutes each, and the thrust is from only what kind of the arguments in favor of a one state, I won't go through all the challenges that I would agree with in terms of the increasing challenges in many ways to I will say, though, that in some ways only we've made it easier. If the bar is to say that two states is impossible, that makes it easier. Indeed, it is. And if the bar for a one state, on the other hand, is then of course that makes that argument possibility as opposed to necessarily a likelihood in terms of where the legitimacy for things stand. So I'll a few minutes on this idea of legitimacy too. So we talk about that. Saliba Sarsar and Ilan Peleg and I all co-edited a book, Continuity and Change in Political Culture, Israel and Beyond, that was published. In that I have a chapter addressing legitimacy. So of course, part of that would pertain to kind of the almost hegemony on the part of the international community for a two-state solution that exists, right? So if you kind of compare the possibility of a one state and the impossibility, as you say, for two states, certainly where the international community is very much in favor, almost in a hegemonic way for a two-state. And whenever it is challenged by the Bennett or anyone else, it faces the reassertion of its advocacy for two states and legitimacy for two states. And you, of course, have that in some ways regionally with the Arab League as well in the past few years, reasserting its advocacy for a two-state solution, and then through the Abraham Accords. But most importantly, I would argue, it's not kind of what I, as a political scientist, or only as a philosopher, would envision as to what necessarily we think, I don't think, is practical or desirable, but rather what Israelis and Palestinians themselves on the ground think is what affords it the most legitimacy. And so there's no question that on one hand, over kind of a 30-year span, if we take a longer view, that legitimacy for two states has actually increased, right? Support for two states is no question higher today than it was in the 1980s. That being said, there's also no question that that's deteriorated with the stagnation of the peace process among both Palestinians and Israelis. The real question, though, is where does the legitimacy still stand despite this weakening and despite the challenges that need to be addressed and the urgency of the situation? Where does the legitimacy stand as compared to alternatives? And if we look at that, actually, in the past 9 months, despite what we had in terms of Bennett support for a one-state solution, and despite the war that we had between Israel and Hamas, support for one state amongst the Palestinians has decreased over the past 9 months. So it decreased from 37% in January to 27% this past September. And if you look at other polls and statistics, the support is even lower than that, 18% among West Bankers, 12% among Gazans, 20% among East Jerusalemites. So the first was the decrease from 37% to 20%. Would you abandon the two-state? Second question was, are you for a one state as it seems on the way you describe it, Omri? So despite you having an Israeli prime minister who says he's for one state, which definitely decreases the legitimacy for two states, and despite a decrease by 10% and for Confederation, it's in the single digits among West Bankers, Gaza, and East Jerusalemites at this point. Among Israelis as well, it's basically over the past 3 years, there's been a decrease of support by 5% for a one-state solution. And it's much lower than even among Palestinians. So there has been an increase for the status quo in recent polls, but not necessarily for one state in terms of the polls. I can show you the details. So there's so much more to say, but I think at the end of the day, not only is legitimacy most importantly defined by the people on the ground in terms of desirability, but when you look at practicability and you say two states is impossible, I'm not sure how that could be when there's been thousands of pages of negotiations over 20 years in which essentially people know that if we came back to those kinds of serious negotiations under leadership and with regional mediation and cooperation, we essentially know the outlines of those two states that have largely already been negotiated. Where in terms of one state, there's never been serious negotiations over one state. We start from scratch. The people would have very different visions of that one state, who would dominate it and how you would get there. So I'm in complete agreement that there's been real significant challenges to the two states, and we could spend a whole hour listing only those. But in comparison to alternatives, the likelihood in terms of both desirability, in terms of the nationalist sentiments of both peoples, and practicability in terms of legitimacy regionally, internationally, and the negotiations that have already taken place, I think definitely suggest that it's both that is indeed more practical as well.
Thank you very much, Yael. And we'll definitely discuss this also more in a few minutes. Let us hear the third panelist here, Dr. Sarsar, who actually grew up in Jerusalem and has written much on the views also of the Palestinian point of view. So I would like to invite you, Salaba, to give us your view on this matter.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here, and also to let you know I prepared the two-pager, which I'll read very fast and then be most willing to entertain any questions and dialogue with the panelists. It is a great honor to be on this panel. Thank you, Dr. Michael Brenner, for your kind invitation, and thank you, Laura Cutler, for your assistance. Since its creation in 1948, Israel has not overcome being a nation at war. A psychology of distrust and fear pervades the land. Israeli national security is determined by survival calculations and peace through strength. The Palestinian search for national self-determination and independence has been intense and beset with obstacles. For Palestinians, remembering Palestine constitutes not only a cultural and political imperative, but also a moral obligation. Historically, both national communities have emphasized the distinct search for and protection of land and power in historic Palestine. This emphasis has overshadowed the quest for conflict resolution during much of the 20th century and continues today. Israeli domination over millions of Palestinians is not defensible. Likewise, complete Palestinian rule over the whole of historic Palestine is untenable. Israelis and Palestinians must improve the world they have made. It is in the best interest of their peoples and the common good. As to the issue of one state or two states, which solution can engender a sense of equality and freedom? Which solution is more feasible? Which solution can put forth a win-win equation? A single democratic state in which Jewish Israelis and Palestinians both ignore their ethno-national identities in favor of a mosaic identity in a joint or binational state, while appealing to some, does not provide a practical path to resolving the conflict. It will result in an unequal and unjust society at best, and continued inter-ethnic and inter-religious conflict at worst. Israel and Palestine living alongside each other in security, prosperity, and peace although not perfect or satisfactory to all, remains the most logical and reasonable. Neither Israelis nor Palestinians, both of whom exist in roughly equivalent numbers between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, are going to vanish from the land. Neither intends to abandon its identity or accept subjugation at the hands of the other. The two-state solution enables Palestinians to advance their search for freedom, independence, and statehood without being anti-Israel. And it enables Israelis to have their security and well-being without being anti-Palestinian. What would facilitate the two-state solution is a confederal framework between two sovereign states of Israel and Palestine. The idea is not to totally separate the two peoples living in the Holy Land, that is divorce, but to empower them to cohabitate in the two respective sovereign states. This cohabitation would allow for greater cooperation and movement between them. How will this work, you might ask? Palestinian and Israeli officials would negotiate a peace agreement with the aim of signing it within a year. An agreement is reached both on the future borders of the two states and other issues and on future confederation, including its potential evolution. Upon signing the agreement, Israel recognizes the Palestinian state as an independent sovereign state. Both governments make all the preparations for the full implementation of the agreement during the next 30 months. During this time, there is no confederation and the jurisdiction of the Palestinian state is in areas A and B. At the end of the preparatory 30-month period, the Palestinian state expands its borders as per agreement, and the Holy Land Confederation is formed. The Confederation would address various issues ranging from the territorial, security, economic, and legal to refugees and Jerusalem. If one of the two states reneges on the Confederation idea, the dismantling of the Confederation occurs according to an established protocol. This, what I've just read to you, is part of a project I'm working on with both Israelis and Palestinians, and a book is coming out shortly, translated in English, translated in Hebrew and Arabic, so it'll be in the three languages. My conclusion, continued occupation, force, and wars are not the answer, as we all agree. Israelis and Palestinians must think beyond their current conditions. They must seriously engage in negotiations to arrive at common interests, not positions, but common interests. Only time will tell how they will work through their contending narratives and issues and actualize a better world for their children and grandchildren. What is clear is that Israelis and Palestinians are neighbors forever. The sooner they start on their shared destiny, the closer they will reach a more hopeful future. The more they near the moderate center, the more likely they are to succeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sarsar. And we have now heard three different points of view in a way: a more one-state republic, a two-state solution, a confederation. But maybe we will find out that the three aren't as far away as we thought. But there are certainly challenges. I mentioned in my beginning a lot of challenges to a two-state solution. Speaking to you, Omri, there are lots of challenges, of course, to a one-state solution as well. We heard from Yael what, is it actually what people on the ground would want? We would have to start negotiations from the ground. Let us think of examples like Yugoslavia in the 1990s, where it seems that Croats and Serbs and Slovenians and Bosnians didn't get along so well. And finally, also, what about the necessity for a Jewish state, which was such a big demand of Zionism from its beginnings? So that's a lot of questions, and you don't have to answer all of them, but I hope you'll also comment on our other speakers briefly.
Yeah, well, those are many questions, and they're all obviously not just legitimate, but valid and important challenges that have to be addressed. So there's not, I'm not going to pretend that I offer any simple solution here because I don't, right? Let me begin perhaps with the last challenge that you raised, Michael, also because I think for many Zionists and for many Jews, it is a main one in the end. The question is not just of what's possible, but also of what we aspire to and what we want, right? And after the Holocaust, naturally, especially not only, but especially after the Holocaust, the need for a Jewish state became a zero-sum game for Jews as a conviction, but also in reality in some years. And I don't want to deny that completely. However, I also want to say that starting to move from the memory of the Holocaust as the absolute legitimation of a Zionist project in the form of a Jewish state is something that it's time to start moving beyond. So unlike what, Leon Wieseltier is now on paper accusing me of regretting that the Jewish state was ever established. That is not true. I think that when Israel was established, I think that there were excellent reasons to establish the state. I probably am alive because of the existence of the state, and I assert this for the record. However, the question is, what is a form, as also Saliba mentioned, to move forward into the future and not just to continue being grounded in the past of the Holocaust. Now, here's an interesting question to Saliba and for me. Saliba mentioned the confederacy rather than a federation. That's the difference between us, right? So Saliba didn't have to read my book. I did not expect that he would. My position is not so far in the sense that I by no means aspire to a one-state solution in which we erase the national identity of Jews or of Palestinians. The idea is precisely to defend the ability to have a notion of self-determination that's inclusive rather than exclusive. That is a notion of national self-determination that allows for the cohabitation of both peoples, and that's the point, on the whole territory. And the reason for that is that I do not believe, as Saliba, if I understand Saliba correctly, doesn't either, that genuine separation is possible. Now, the question is then, what is the difference between a confederation and a federation, which I propose? And of course, the difference is one that doesn't have to be of 0 and 1, right? Doesn't have to be like that. It's a difference that I think emerges on a certain spectrum. I believe that each of the federative states, cantons, if you want to call them, will have self-determination, some level of sovereignty. However, that in the end, sovereignty will belong to all citizens on the whole territory because it will depend on a joint constitution that would regulate the equal rights of everybody on the territory. Part of that constitution has to be, Saliba, in my book, by all means, the recognition of the national rights of each of the people, right? So that's actually an important element of that situation. So the distinction between national self-determination and national sovereignty is, I think, is important. Here's why I reject, or I'm not a fan of the confederative ideas. By the way, I have it on the authority of a very reliable source, that's President Steinmeier of Germany. That's Yossi Beilin is completing a book now on a confederacy as well. I do not believe in a confederacy because I believe that it depends on the possibility of a two-state solution. In order to really have a confederation that does not deteriorate into a form of Bantustans, where an alleged sovereign Palestinian state is not genuinely sovereign, but is called that by the Jewish state, is a situation that scares me a lot. I think that the only way in order to ensure a future of cohabitation is to begin with the notion that the two people really are equal, can be equal citizens in one state. and then to walk out towards the ways in which we carve out different national identities. We see now in Haaretz, I do not know your vision, Saliba, and I'm looking forward to reading it. In Haaretz, you see nowadays people who support the Confederacy. I'm a Kantian universalist, not a post-colonial thinker at all. But frankly, you see people who support a confederacy, and Saliba, I do not suggest that you are, but they are colonialists. They explain that the Palestinian state will be sovereign, but will not have a military. The Israeli military will be controlling it, but not as an occupation force. If that magic could be done, I suggest doing it right now, that an Israeli military will control the Palestinian territories, but the Palestinian state will still be a sovereign state. I think that we need to start by taking no shortcuts on the notion of full equality between Jews and Palestinians on the whole territory, and by all means work to ensure the way in which we carve out identities. Now, this is not going to be easy. I think that this is extremely far-fetched and dangerous for the reasons that also Michael mentioned. However, I do think, Yael, that this is the only possible alternative at the moment. You're right about the logical magic that I did at the beginning of my talk. I believe in that. It's not a magic, it's a very difficult and dangerous situation in which a two-state solution, in my view, is impossible, whereas a one-state solution, which is a far-fetched possibility, is something we have to fight for. And I think that if we fail, by the way, the consequences are awful. The consequences are the possibility of a second Nakba, for example. But here is for the question of legitimacy and the question of what people believe on the ground. Yeah, you mentioned that the support of the two-state solution is increasing. I know that story from Israel. Those numbers always they seem weird to me. In the country where I come from, there is right now a full consensus in parliament, the best poll that I know, against the two-state solution. I'm not sure if anyone in this room believes that Yair Lapid or Benny Gantz believe in a two-state solution. I don't know if anybody thinks that Benjamin Netanyahu believes in a two-state solution. Short of Meretz, that at this point speaks very little of a two-state solution, if at all, and they did before entering the coalition. I'll say it again, also Meretz does not speak of a two-state solution. They speak of separation from the Palestinians and about the end of the occupation, all sorts of constellations that can work out without speaking of a genuinely sovereign Palestinian state. You would not hear Benny Gantz speaking about that or believing in that. The claim that they do, but they don't speak about this is awkward. Those people supported Trump's deal of the century that goes to Benny Gantz, who supports annexations in the Jordan Valley, and Yair Lapid, who were excited about that. I'm not as optimistic as many people in the center left, the so-called center left in Israel, of the rise of the support in the two-state solution. As to the decline in the support of a one-state solution, I think that we need to ask very carefully what one-state solution we're talking about. Of course, there is a huge support in Israel for a one-state solution, which is just the status quo. And Israel is supported by and large. Definitely Israel's prime minister supports it. Definitely the whole right wing supports it. Together they would already make basically the majority. And I would argue that Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid are happy with the status quo and are happy with what Micha Goodman calls sustaining the situation and shrinking the conflict. So I do not see I understand the polls that you mentioned, Yael, but I don't see the political situation as a political situation that I recognize in the country. What I think we ought to do, and that is stated as a philosopher rather than a scientist. I allow myself to make, and philosophy is maybe less democratic than that, if you'd like. I allow myself to make claims about what I understand ought to be, and to try to convince people, not necessarily as an activist, as a philosopher, of what I think they ought to support, what would be the thing that would have most legitimacy, what turns a political party like the Joint List should start supporting. I believe, I'll try to be short, I believe that the way to begin moving forward, this is just a very small step, is to draw on the Joint List for making a genuine joint Israeli-Palestinian politics, and to draw on that list as a bridge also to the leadership of Palestinians in the West Bank. I think this is not impossible. I think that we are seeing signs that also Palestinians in the West Bank say can look to Ayman Odeh as someone who could also lead a Palestinian transition. That's of course very far-fetched. It's not going to be Ayman Odeh or anything of the sort, but a politics of that type needs to be done in Israel, which is a sovereign in the area, in order to transition into full rights to all citizens.
Thank you, Omri. We unfortunately have limited time, so we want to hear from the others, but thank you for explaining your view. And I know both Yael and Sally Baver, of course, mentioned and I'm sure you both want to respond. Who wants to go first?
Go ahead, yeah.
Sally?
Let's keep it short so that others will join in.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it short. Just pointing out a couple of things. One is that you argue that in one state, both peoples will be able to exercise self-determination, but simultaneously you claim that two states is impossible because there'll be a majority of Palestinians, and therefore, even though Mahmoud Abbas had seemed amenable and the Palestinian Authority, and since 1993 have been amenable to a two-state solution in that 23% as not ideal, but as satisfactory, you're saying that wouldn't be just or practicable given that the Palestinians will be a majority. Well, in order to exercise self-determination, you need a majority. So, so that doesn't seem to make sense. You also say they could write a constitution and which would assure equality for all citizens. But of course, as we know, Israel hasn't even been able to write a constitution for its own state over its existence, much less, and they haven't been able, as you say, to agree to a two-state solution. So how they would agree to a constitution that ensures equality when no state on earth actually there's equality in actuality in any state on earth to varying degrees, is kind of, it sounds like a utopia, but it wouldn't sound, as I said, a utopia to a lot of people on the ground. In terms of the surveys, you're right that there are definite challenges with many parties not even, unfortunately and tragically, talking in terms of two states, but rather in terms of separation. But I think the surveys are clear that support for one state has decreased from 19% to 15%, despite the prime minister's positions. And what's interesting is about half of Israel-Beitenu voters are for two states, and about a third of members of United right parties seem to be amenable to. So again, when you look at beyond the surveys of people to actually the politics, you see discouraging things in terms of greater challenges to two states, which are certainly there. But you also see shifts over 20 years from right parties moving to the center or within right parties that have accepted two states. So I would kind of point to that in terms of whether, you know, we could spend so much time talking about it, but I'll just try to keep it to 30 seconds. That a Jewish democracy is impossible. Of course, as we all know, they're constantly in tension with each other. And unfortunately, with the nation state bill, there are increasing challenges to the democracy part and increasing challenges to Israel's democracy. That being said, I mean, there's so many nation states in the world that have achieved, even though it's continually contested, trying to balance, having a democracy that moves towards ensuring greater individual rights and even national rights while maintaining an ethnic identity. So certainly other states have managed to do that. And I think experiment for Israel is not decidedly over in terms of its ability to perhaps move in a different direction again. But Saliba, why don't you go ahead and
Yeah.
prevent your-
What Omri mentioned, fine and well, but he's closer to the American federative model, and I'm closer to the European model. The intention is to have sovereign states equal with all the rights and privileges and so on, and cooperating together. The area is too small. There are all kinds of issues dealing with security, borders, transportation, tourism, sewage treatment, whatever, from the very grand to the very small. And it will behoove both states to cooperate and put forward a program that will improve their lives, their security, their well-being. Maybe what I'm going to say now is philosophical, but I'm interested in peace today. I'm not interested in peace in 200 years from now. I want it for the lives of my children and grandchildren. I think most Palestinians and Israelis would argue the same thing. I have been through war myself. I have lost loved ones. And the way to move forward is to have immediate movement towards peace agreement. I know this is far-fetched given current conditions, but we really need to do the work starting right now. And I've developed a 10-point program as to what needs to happen today to bring us to a conclusion of a peace agreement. And then if the parties, two sovereign states, wish to move ahead to a confederation, they are welcome to do so. The one-state solution worries me in that it is not achievable. It's not as achievable. As Yael has mentioned, the state of Israel does not have a constitution. It's almost 73 plus years, and it's not happening. They even have what is called Declaration of the Establishment of the State of Israel. And it states very clearly in paragraph 13, the state of Israel will be based on freedom, justice, and peace. It will ensure complete equality of all social, political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. If this is taking so many years to even accomplish that one paragraph, and we are not yet there, imagine what it will take to bring us to some type of equality over the next decade, 2 decades, 3 decades. Some Palestinians would insist to have a one state because they want to pressure Israel to wake up. Some others among the Jewish community want 2 states because they know that cannot get accomplished as fast as need be. I am, like I want to say all of you, I am interested in peace today. How do we bring it about over the next 5 years, 10 years, not the next 200 years? If we have the luxury of time, I would say, yes, let's go for no borders. Let's have a borderless world. But in our bordered reality, a 2-state will be more just so that the Palestinians will enjoy whatever the Israelis have. They'll be working on equal terminology, equal symmetry. Yes, there might be asymmetry one way, asymmetry another way, but on the whole, they will feel at home in their own piece of land. The Israelis will feel at home in their own piece of land, and then they can cooperate. That's the basic, simple idea that I'm proposing.
Thank you very much, both Yael and Salibar, for your responses. And we would take the first question from the audience, and please, we already have quite a few, but please continue feeding the Q&A. The question by Alan Wormser is, none of the speakers has addressed the issues that have hung up any solutions so far: the acceptance, expansion of the settlements, and the right of return of for the Palestinians. How would these issues be addressed under the solutions proposed? Omri, can I ask you for a short answer?
You can ask and I can try to comply. The short answer is that one advantage that the idea of a federation would have is that it would not require the evacuation of the settlements, not of all of them. I do not say so gladly because I would love to see those settlements being evacuated, but that constellation, the federative constellation, will not depend on the reversibility of the settlement project, precisely for the same reason that it would also allow the Palestinians the right of return, not just to all areas in the West Bank and Gaza, but also into the rest of the territories of 48. This does not mean that this right of return needs to be given to absolutely everybody. However, large numbers can be agreed about in that federation that would allow the return of Palestinians. And indeed, one of the reasons for this federation is a recognition also of the rights of Palestinians to return. I will add that the Begin Plan, which I use in my book, actually had a clause of this sort, namely dictating that Palestinians in some numbers that will be decided on together will be able to return to the territory and receive citizenship, Israeli citizenship, and live on the full territory. So that's the direction in which I would go.
Let me continue with Sally Bind, your plan of a federation.
I'm really advocating for a two-state solution. And if the two states wish to continue and develop those plans for collaboration, that's wonderful. And that's what I refer to as confederation. There are many models, but I'm leaving it up to negotiation. In terms of settlements are not conducive to any peace. They need to be stopped. In terms of refugees, that refugee issue has to be addressed according to international law, and there is UN Resolution 194, which talks about the right of return, but also if return cannot be accomplished, full compensation needs to be brought forward. So Palestinians have the right to return, but there are conditions, and how do you work out these conditions? You do them through negotiations based on humanitarian law, international law, UN resolutions, as accepted by all countries, including Israel.
Thank you. Yael, do you want to add from the two-state
Sure,
perspective?
just real quick, there's no question that Israeli settlements and even the news we heard this week on continuation of Israeli settlements is a huge challenge to a two-state solution, trust in it, and so there needs to be, I think, real conversation, regional incentives to stop that, right? If the unity government isn't supposed to make any significant changes as to these issues, then settlement should be part. But as I think Omer also acknowledged, that's not necessarily the main obstacle to reaching two states, as many argue have to be evacuated. Of course, 8,000 were evacuated in Gaza for a two-state solution. Most settlers, as opposed to settlements, would be able to stay in a land swap based on the 1967 borders formula. So that although it's a huge challenge, ultimately could be resolved if Saliba is hopefully right. This decade, it would still be resolvable. The refugees issue is a huge challenge, but in previous sets of negotiations, there was an understanding that the implementation of the right of return would be heavily curtailed. And Saeb Erekat, of course, with the Pali leaks and with his initial resignation as a consequence, essentially seemed to have agreed to of the right of return to reach a two-state solution. And the Arab League also has agreed to a just and agreed solution to the refugee, that there would be a compromise in terms of implementation that Israel could agree to. So although this is a very difficult situation, it's kind of, I think, trying to put a lens on, despite the challenges, that at the end of the day, we may very well see it recent polls in December 2020 among Palestinians have said that 45% prefer building refugee return, in which there was 29% preferring refugee return. So there's at least 16% higher for building in terms of your several of your priorities, what the trade-offs or prioritization among those interests are, that state that perhaps implementation of refugee return, there'd be some support for that in comparison to having a state and building a state. So, we'll see. That was obviously also Salam Fayyad's preference. It seems like the United States and Egypt are trying to get some kind of move towards a unity government in which there'd be technocrats and he would preside. Mahmoud Abbas seems to be opposing that. But that certainly would conform with what was Salam Fayyad's vision to kind of build the state. And then maybe, in terms of the hierarchy of priorities, the refugee return or full return or implementation of return, there'd be room for compromise there.
Mhm.
Thank you, Yael. And unfortunately, we hear you sometimes fading out from your voice, but I think we got
I apologize for that. It seems to be my connection. I'm sorry.
And I see also a question from a student I'd like to call on, Jason Churchfield. Jason asks, basically, should the mobilization towards a solution, whether it is 2 states or 1 state, should it start from the top or the bottom? What's the process we should actually take? Omri, I see you're nodding. You want to say a few words on that?
I think it's a wonderful question. It goes back to also something that Yael mentioned about my stance as a philosopher, so to speak, and the question of legitimacy. I think it needs to come from both. I think that it is a task of philosophers, intellectuals, whomever really, to make not just observations about how the situation is on the ground, including the question what people actually support, but rather to come top down and to try to convince people to what we believe ought to be supported. That's something that I believe in. However, the transition needs to also happen bottom up. With the work of activists on the ground, social workers, people who fight against the occupation, and so forth. Very fast to say something about something that Yael also said. I do not think that the settlement project just poses a challenge. I think that even if some settlements will not have to be evacuated in order to create a 2-state solution, I think that we're looking at hundreds of thousands of settlers that will have to be evacuated for a sovereign Palestinian state, say as a part of a confederacy, in order to be possible. I think that Ariel will have to be evacuated for that. I do not think that in those 22%, given to 50% of the population, we can also have a prosperous Israeli city in the middle of that. Those are the...
you think or you don't think that we can?
I do not think that we can have, that the Palestinian state is possible in 22% for that population, with some of the territory in Gaza, some in the West Bank, and the settlements, including one that was established deliberately at the heart of the West Bank in order to interrupt all territorial continuity, is something that's viable. Saliba is, I understand Saliba's wish to have justice and peace. Peace, not justice now. I share that wish, and I share it mostly for you, Saliba. I think that Jews are better off in this constellation at the moment. I'm asking what is the best way to achieve it. So we do not, I completely agree about the urgency of achieving peace now, not something that's just vision for the future. And I'm not convinced that a confederacy allows that.
Mm-hmm. Let me connect this, Saliba, with one more question, if I may. And that's the question of another from the audience. What if Hamas does not swear off military resistance and acknowledgement of the state of Israel? And we know that, of course, now if there were elections in the West Bank, Hamas would also have a good chance of winning. So how much of a tolerance can there be from a Jewish state towards a government that does not recognize a Jewish state on the other side?
Let me, I don't know if I'll answer the question directly, but let me first answer very quickly the prior question, which builds on this. Once negotiations are underway, once the majority of Palestinians and Israelis feel that this is the right course, there is no option left for extremists not to be on board. But if they don't want to be on board, let them be out. Over the years, Israel has used this all Arab world encompassing and threatening. Then they use the issue of infiltrations. Now there is Hamas. On the Palestinian side, we think of the extremist settlers and so on. All of this for me is ultimately noise. What needs to happen is an agreement that will bring the top and the bottom. Really, there needs to be what I call synchronization between peace building and peacemaking. Peacemaking at the top, peace building at the bottom, meeting in the middle, cooperating together, bringing this about. And without reading a whole slew of things, I know we are short on time, but we need to start now to reach a common understanding of the language of peace. We need to socialize for peace through education. The leaders themselves are obligated to start talking to their population about what will the future look like. I love the idea of philosophers and others having a real impact to tell what does it mean to live in a state of peace instead of war and conflict for generations. So in short answer to the question, yes, there needs to be synchronization on one hand, and the other, we need to bring the Palestinians and the Israelis in conversations separately first, and then collectively together later on to make that happen. So when an agreement is signed, it is not just a piece of paper, it becomes an embodiment for a better future for both of them.
Thank you. And I know we're running out of time. Maybe last brief comment from Yael, also about the fears many Israelis have with the state next side by side, which might pose a threat to Israel.
Yeah, and I agree with Saliba on this. There's always going to be spoilers, right? Whether they're the settlements in the middle of the West Bank, and I'm not equating the two completely, but in terms of challenges to reaching peace, or Hamas, which of course still, officially opposes and has for many years. That's one of the reasons we don't have two states right now. Among, in addition to settlements and leadership on both sides, is Hamas's opposition, violent opposition to that during the peace process and the Oslo process. So, and even today, even though there can be reasons for pragmatism. So I agree with Saliba completely. And even for a one-state solution, you'd never have a consensus among both populations that supports it. You'd have spoilers on both sides trying to foil it and to foil its establishment. So I think that you have that with a two-state solution too. You can't let spoilers prevent you from trying to negotiate a two-state solution. Yitzhak Rabin always said that you have to do what's in your interest, what's in Palestinian national interest, which is an Israeli national interest as defined by the plurality or majority of the population and its leadership, and not wait, even though there are legitimate fears in terms of Hamas taking over a government or something like that. I think then if you had a two-state agreement, it would empower the moderates and peacemakers and peace builders, as Saliba describes them, on both sides. It would empower those people, and it would either kind of weaken Hamas and support for Hamas, or cause it to moderate as well, or splinter and have some part of Hamas or a changing platform of Hamas at least accept a two-state solution reluctantly or begrudgingly, as it would for people on the right in Israel. So I think you're never going to get consensus for any solution, but you're certainly going to empower the moderates and those willing to compromise and weaken the extremists on both sides by moving ahead as urgently as possible to try to achieve a peace agreement, hopefully with new leaderships on both sides and regional mediation and international mediation, given kind of what we all know it will more or less look like in the end from previous negotiations. It kind of, you need the will to get there. And I still think it's very much possible, although it's certainly disheartening, all the challenges that exist.
Well, thank you. Thank you to all three of you, and of course to our audience. It's almost 30 years ago that Shimon Peres published a book called The New Middle East. The New Middle East today still looks pretty much like the old Middle East. Of course, there are differences. There are the Abraham Accords. There are other differences. It depends from which point of view. If you look at it from Tel Aviv, from Jerusalem, from Gaza, from Ramallah, it looks, of course, very different from all of those perspectives. And I think while we were not able and will not be able to solve the conflict here, it is these inspirations, I think, that are important for politics and policy making as well. So I thank you not just for your contributions today, but also for your writings. And I think for the audience, if you want to dig more deeply into these questions, go and read more. Go and get the Continuity and Change in Political Culture, Israel and Beyond, which both Yael and Saliba co-edited, and also Omri's new book, The Haifa Republic. We might not agree with everything that's in these books, but I think it's very necessary for all of us, and I speak to our students too, to get as many possible and reasonable sides as we can get to build our own opinions. And I hope in that respect, our conversation, even though very much limited in time, was able to contribute just a little bit. Thank you so much for giving your time. And let's hope that in another 5 or 10 years, when we sit here, it's not all the same, but some things have actually improved for both sides. Thank you so much. And thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.